Are we ready? Dr. Orla Slatttery is a philosopher and educator at Mary Immaculate College. After undertaking an undergraduate degree in philosophy in 2004, she did a master's degree on the quest for objectivity, the evolution of idealism in the philosophies of Berkeley, Kant, and Schopenhauer. For her doctoral thesis, she subsequently explored George Berkeley's philosophical and scientific writings. Orla is inclusion coordinator in Mary Immaculate College for adults with intellectual disability. She has also lectured in the Department of Educational Psychology, Inclusive and Special Education, and she has special responsibility for the Certificate in General Learning and Personal Development, which aims to enhance the personal, social, and academic development of adults with intellectual disabilities. Orla has published in the area of Berkeley's common sense approach to Locke's theory of inferential knowledge. Her research interests include the philosophy of George Berkeley and the history of early modern science and optics. She has also published in the area of inclusive education. We're absolutely delighted to have Orla with us today to speak. Thank you so much for coming, Orla. We look forward to hearing about the relationship between God and man in George Berkeley's works on vision.
Thank you, Trish, and thanks to yourself and Ian and everybody at the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies for the very kind invitation. As I've said today, my main aim, I suppose, in preparing this talk was not to assume any particular degree of background knowledge in modern philosophy or in George Berkeley. So those who are well acquainted with the subject matter, I hope, will forgive me if I'm trotting over a very obvious and introductory ground. But I wanted to, I suppose, share a little bit of my own research interest in Berkeley, my PhD focusing in particular on a reinterpretation of his 1709 work on vision, and following in the tradition of scholars like Margaret Atherton, I believe very firmly that Berkeley enacts a revolution in the visual sciences, and I'll tell you a little bit about that today. And I suppose my talk is aiming, given the context and the forum to which I'm presenting, my talk is aiming to culminate in a brief examination of the relationship between God and man that follows on from my interpretation of Berkeley's account as presented in the works on vision. So a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through the modern period and through the life of George Berkeley. And I know that, and again, a huge thank you to Professor Mark Hyde for being here today. So I'll begin just by reiterating ground that Mark has already covered last semester, just by giving a little bit of context to the historic circumstances of Berkeley's life. So Berkeley was born in Thomastown near Kilkenny in 1685, matriculating to Trinity at the ripe old age of 15 in 1700, as was the custom of the time. So he receives his degree and becomes a junior fellow at Trinity in 1707, and therein begins a long and distinguished association with Trinity College. The period for which he is perhaps best known is the so-called heroic period, wherein he publishes a number of his canonical texts, which are regarded as containing the main substance of his philosophical system. And in particular here, when we're looking at the mature Berkeley's writings, we're looking in particular at the Principles of Human Knowledge, published in 1710, and the Three Dialogues, published in 1713. We're also, I suppose, taking into account today, given the context of my presentation, the New Theory of Vision, which was his first published work in 1709. He also has quite an interesting life travelling. He engages in a number of European tours, one of which to Italy, where it is alleged that he loses a very important manuscript, the second version of the Principles, which was to contain his theory of mind. He subsequently becomes the Dean of Derry. He gets married, I think, as well in 1728 to Anne Foster, and he sets off for the Americas, where he had the great sort of ideal of founding a university, but the money for which was not forthcoming. So the Bermuda project that he had hoped to initiate did not come to fruition. So he returns then to Ireland, where he becomes the Bishop of Cloyne, subsequently retiring to Oxford, where he dies overseeing the education of his son, and today is buried at Christ Church. So that's just, and I'll try to be briefer actually as I move on. But one of the wonderful things about the time in which Berkeley writes, and one of the reasons that I am just so passionate about George Berkeley, and something that we maybe don't focus enough on particularly when we're educating undergraduates in Ireland about philosophy, is that at the time that he wrote, Ireland was actually in the grips of, and very much at the centre of, a golden age of Irish philosophy. So there is so much philosophical wisdom and philosophical inquiry happening in and around Trinity College. And we see here, hopefully, my apologies for the resolution, we see lots of the luminaries and philosophers of the period, with George Berkeley at its centre as kind of the leading light. And today, hopefully, we will see why Berkeley's legacy is still so celebrated. So in terms of the context in which Berkeley wrote, and perhaps the broader international context outside of this wonderful golden age of Irish philosophy, the canon of natural philosophy in the 18th century features a number of very interesting scientific developments. And one of the things that we talk so much about in academia at the moment is a call for interdisciplinary studies. And one of the reasons I love the modern period is because everybody was interdisciplinary. There was no distinction even between science and philosophy. Science, as we know it today, began life as natural philosophy, with Newton writing his very famous principles called Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica. So natural philosophy was science, and everyone of this period, they were writing on optics, they were engaging with the new science in terms of discoveries in microscopy, so which I'll tell you a little about in a moment. But some of the predominant scientific theories in the context in which Berkeley lived, studied and wrote were the Newtonian concept of absolute space and time. There's also a very interesting preoccupation with optics and perception. So everyone from Descartes to Berkeley, lots of people very interested in how it is we perceive the world. And when we talk about epistemology in a contemporary context, I think it's fair to say that we're talking in philosophical terms about knowledge justification. But to my mind, when we talk about epistemology or the study of knowledge in the modern period, we're talking about how we form the perceptions that lead us to our understanding of the external world. And so these are the things that are very much in focus as Berkeley works and writes. It's also an era of great technical innovation and the emergence of microscopy. And I've put this in just for fun because it's absolutely one of my favorite books in the world. It's this beautifully illustrated book by Hooke that was published in 1665, interestingly, the year just before the Great Fire of London. But it's full of the most marvelous illustrations of the world as seen for the very first time through a microscope. And this is so interesting because during this era of technical innovation, we're seeing further, we're seeing deeper, but at the same time, there is something happening that is somewhat pernicious that Berkeley is trying to warn against, and this is the rise of skepticism. So there's almost a distrust that the unaided senses are in a position to enable us to encounter reality at its most fundamental. So even in the introduction here to Hooke's Micrographia, that kind of sums this up in a really nice way. He says that there's this notion that the unaided senses are limited and ill-equipped to enable us to access the true nature of the natural world. He says, the forces of our own minds conspire to betray us. The first thing to be undertaken in this weighty work is watchfulness over the failings and an enlargement of the dominion of the senses. So our sensory knowledge is in some way limited is the proposition that Hooke and others are making here. And so much of the interest in perception is to do with this. Are we in touch, this notion of, are we actually in touch with reality, or are we in touch with just the mere show of things? And what does this mean in terms of our epistemological standpoint? So the study of perception then is of central importance, and that lovely fluid plate there is the one that Mark has on his wonderful 2008 book. So there is a predominant focus, for example, on the different sensory modalities and how these interact. So while there is a predominant interest in vision, we're looking at all of the senses and sensory ideas. And one of the problems that philosophers of this time are looking at, and indeed George Berkeley does so too in the new theory, is the problem of common sensibles, which is a problem associated with precisely this. Are there sensory modalities? Are there ideas common to more than one sensory modality? So this is a huge question at the time, as we can appreciate the study of perception being in its infancy, and very much the whole discussion carved out in terms of ideas as objects of consciousness, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a moment. So there's also while there's all of this wonderful science happening, there's also a deep and all-pervasive interest in the role which God plays in perception. And this is central throughout all of the systems of the time. Again, this wonderful coexistence of theological discussion with scientific investigation and philosophical rigor, all going hand in hand. So just to revise then the core tenets of George Berkeley's philosophical system, and just a little image there of the Long Hall in Trinity. So Berkeley's immaterialism denies the existence of matter, and this is perhaps one of the most controversial aspects of Berkeley's philosophical system, which I think when we understand it is not as controversial at all as it initially seems. Berkeley is an idealist. In that he affirms the existence of minds and ideas, saying that esse is percipi, so that the essence of that which exists consists in being perceived. Berkeley is also concerned to refute skepticism and to promote what he calls a common sense outlook. So in the the introduction to the principles, he sides himself very nobly with the vulgar man who walks the plain road of common sense, because within the scientific edifice of the time, there is this pernicious skepticism creeping in with regard to a lack of veracity in what we're actually perceiving to be the essence of reality, and this metaphysical speculation that he feels is to be refuted. He's also deeply religious and centrally concerned, to affirm the existence of God, and this is something that pervades all of his philosophical texts, and I know that Mark has spoken on some length on that issue. So with regard to, I suppose, the most controversial aspect of his philosophy, his controversial denial of matter, it's often assumed that when he denies matter, that what he's saying is that he's denying things in what we would call commonsensically the real world. But Berkeley is not denying the existence of tables or chairs or coaches in the street. What he is actually doing is denying a very particular philosophic conception. But I love this particular statue here, and just a little quote from Johnson, who says, this is taken from the life of Boswell, and Johnson was one of Berkeley's most seething critics on the topic of immaterialism. After we came out of the church, we stood talking for some time together of Bishop Berkeley's ingenious sophistry to prove the non-existence of matter, and that everything in the universe is merely ideal. I shall never forget the alacrity with which Johnson answered, striking his foot with mighty force against a large stone till he rebounded from it, saying, I refute it thus. But happily, Johnson's sardonic irreverence is no match for Berkeley's philosophical dexterity, because Berkeley is very clear about that which he is denying. And sorry, I hope that isn't too small to read. So what he denies again is not the existence of what we would call real things in the world, such as the everyday objects of experience, but he denies merely an esoteric philosophical conception of matter. So he says, in the principles, the only thing whose existence we deny is that which the philosophers call matter or corporeal substance. And in doing this, there is no damage done to the rest of mankind, who I dare say will never miss it. So there are real things in Berkeley's system, in spite of what Johnson might have us believe. So in terms of Berkeley's metaphysical system, while Berkeley rejects material causation, so he rejects this notion that matter in some way causes the world of our perceptions to exist. So while he rejects that matter is the cause, he retains the principle of causality and reasons that we perceive a continual succession of ideas. Some are anew excited, others are changed or totally disappear. There is therefore some cause of these ideas whereon they depend and which produces them. The cause of ideas is an incorporeal, active substance or spirit. So in so doing, in moving away from material causation and espousing spiritual causation, Berkeley is embracing a theme that will come, as I've said, to pervade all of his philosophy, which is the centrality of the divine mind, not only in Berkeley's world, but as having, as I hope to show, a very intimate relationship with man that follows on in part from his works on vision. And this brings us to, I think, what is Berkeley's central objective. And it's really, really important to mention this because a lot of my work focuses on the degree to which I think Berkeley preempts a lot of more contemporary developments in the visual sciences. But Berkeley is through and through very much a modern scholar with a deep reverence for and almost a duty to create a context for religious worship within the philosophical context. So Berkeley's central objective is beautifully given to us there towards the conclusion of the principles. He says, what deserves the first place in our studies is the consideration of God and our duty, which to promote, as it was the main drift and design of my labours. So shall I esteem them altogether useless and ineffective, if by what I have said, I cannot inspire my readers with a pious sense of the presence of God. So the manner in which he seeks to inspire a pious sense of the manner of God is something that I hope by the end of our presentation today we will have an insight into. So moving on, I suppose, a little bit towards my discussion and my main research interest in Berkeley, which are the works on vision. I've just charted out some of Berkeley's main works here. And something he says in a letter to Johnson is very, very interesting. He says, I wish that all the things I have published on these philosophical subjects were read in the order wherein I published them, to take in the design and connection of them. So the reason I'm showing that to you, oh yes, they do come up. So the new theory is published right at the start of his publishing career. The Theory of Vision Vindicated, which is the second work he publishes after an empirical study, is published in London, and I'll tell you about that as we go along. And the third work that deals somewhat with the topic of vision, more so with the notion of the divine mind, is the Alciphron. So almost at the beginning and the end of his substantive philosophical career, Berkeley is very interested in vision, and he never loses this interest. So to my mind, one of the reasons I became so interested in Berkeley's works on vision and what they could tell us was a lot of the literature was suggesting that perhaps the new theory of vision in 1709, he presents a partial version of immaterialism, for example, that he abandons by the time he comes to write the principles the following year. So that this notion in the scholarship that I'll just show you now, that the 1709 new theory of vision, it sets out to establish the immaterialism of visual ideas with a view to launching full immaterialism in the principles of 1710, so that it's actually a youthful prelude to more mature views. And the substance of that particular interpretation is that Berkeley effectively abandons the core claims of the new theory. So vision is something almost, to put it very bluntly, that he kind of dabbles around with, but then gets on to more substantive philosophical topics. I don't think that's the case. I think that Berkeley essentially, well, he is undoubtedly because of the chronology of the published works, but there is a reason why Berkeley never, as I think Lou says, loses the child for the love of his youth. He has a predominant and sustained interest in vision. And the reason for that is because I think what he's actually doing is he's not trying to present a partial case for metaphysics in the new theory of vision. What he is actually doing is he is addressing a very significant problem in the visual sciences regarding how we perceive spatially. So I think, yes, the new theory can have and does have certainly metaphysical implications, but the main aim of the new theory is to address a scientific problem. And we see here to the right a wonderful diagram that we find in Descartes' dioptrics, which, as I discovered pretty early on, Descartes didn't put there himself, but it is in all of the published works. So it's just a lovely idea of the way in which the study of vision was approached geometrically, and I'll say a little bit more about that. So there's a problem that Berkeley is addressing within the visual sciences, and I think that's the main thrust and aim of the new theory of vision. So throughout his publishing career, Berkeley demonstrates a central preoccupation with vision. Many contemporary scholars disagree regarding the nature and significance of Berkeley's central objective, which he tells us is twofold. So he says in the opening entry, "My design is to show the manner wherein we perceive by sight the distance, magnitude and situation of objects, also to consider the difference there is betwixt the ideas of sight and touch, and whether there be any idea common to both senses." Now, I don't know, would Mark agree with this? But I certainly, having spent, undoubtedly Mark has done many years reading the new theory of vision, I think it's quite a dense work in that it can be difficult at times, certainly from my initial scopes through the work, to actually figure out what it is Berkeley is getting at. So I dug through it for many years, and one of the things I did as well was I looked at the wider context, like for example what I've just showed you there, Descartes, to see what it was he was reacting against. So what is this problem in the visual sciences that Berkeley finds so problematic, and why is he trying to solve, as he says, this problem of distance, given that he is actually interested in what we would call a scientific problem in the visual sciences that is central to his larger philosophical campaign. So this is another diagram that we find associated with Descartes' theory. So Berkeley is chiefly reacting in the new theory of vision. He offers a critique of geometrical optics. Now, I promise this is actually going to come back to God and man in a while, so just please bear with me. I hope it's making sense, and thank you so much for indulging me. But Berkeley's critique of geometrical optics is one of the main discussions that we find in the new theory. And in this, he is opposing Descartes primarily. So what he rejects is the view that the mind has an inbuilt form of innate geometry which computes the location of objects in space. Now, what's very interesting is you open a lot of textbooks today on visual perception and distance perception, and you see something quite similar to this. Albeit in a far more kind of contemporary fancy presentation. And one of the reasons I think this is interesting is because it's easy, it's a huge mistake to read Berkeley as somebody who's simply a Christian apologist who's opposed to new science, who's opposed to scientific investigation. And at first blush, when you read the new theory and his critique of Descartes, it might seem that he is just opposing this kind of newly founded scientific and very mathematical and trigonomical approach to the study of vision. But as we dig deeper, we actually find that it's a far more interesting account than this. So one of the reasons Berkeley is opposed to this whole way of looking at vision, so what he actually accepts is he has no problem with the view, as we know, that light impacts the retina, and then there's a causal sort of chain of events, brain states occur, any number of things happen before we end up with a representation in the mind. Well, there's something about what happens after light impacts the retina that Berkeley has an issue with. And so where Berkeley takes issue with Descartes is not in terms of how he plots out the the geometry of light impacting the retina, but the notion that the brain in some way works according to the laws of geometry. And I think one of the reasons why he's opposed to this, interestingly enough, is an interesting passage that he gives us on mental operations that occurs in one of the notebooks. And I think for me, this is quite significant reading this as I was going through the new theory, trying to examine the claims therein. So Berkeley says in the notebooks that the grand mistake we make is to think that we have ideas of the operations of our minds. This metaphorical dress is an argument we have not. So from this, I take him to be proposing what I think Bertolt Frege has called a black box theory of mind. So we can talk about the stimulus in the case of vision, the light impacting the retina. That's subject to empirical investigation. We can talk about the response and our conscious state and the idea that we have, but we can't really perceive what's happening in the mind itself. So Descartes' theory is purporting to do precisely just that by mapping out mental operations along geometrical lines. And while mathematically there's something very satisfying about that as a theoretical structure, Berkeley says it is that only, a theoretic structure that really we cannot have any empirical evidence of. So given that Berkeley is rejecting the notion that we can see into the mind's operations, and that he rejects the very prominent notion that the mind computes distance and we perceive spatially through this inbuilt kind of geometric calculation, how does he then go about proposing his theory of how we perceive spatially? So that's his central aim in the new theory, to come up, I think, with a new theory of spatial perception. One of the key things within the new theory, so in addition to his very extensive critique of Descartes, is he writes extensively on the case of the Molyneux man. And many different scholars on Berkeley have questioned the significance of these entries, claiming very basically that they don't really serve to tell us all that much about, you know, what Berkeley is purporting to achieve. So the Molyneux problem and the Molyneux man, for those of us who may not have heard of it, the Molyneux problem, firstly, is perhaps one of the most discussed problems in the history of philosophy, still discussed today. I was at a conference on it there not so long ago. But the Molyneux problem is a thought experiment, essentially about somebody who was born blind. And the question asks, if the man born blind, so somebody who was blind all of their life, if their vision was magically restored, would they be able to distinguish between a cube and a sphere, so two different three-dimensional objects, by sight alone? So teasing out answers to this kind of question had huge implications, not only in philosophy, but in psychology, and today it's still very much discussed. But Berkeley's answer is no. He says no to this question. And if we look at, and you'll be glad I don't have time to get into this in any detail today, but if we look at his extensive discussion on the Molyneux subject, we find that spatial perception is a process which involves visual acuity in combination with active engagement in the world. So it's only after a period of learning to engage with the objects in his environment that the Molyneux subject is able to make these kind of spatial distinctions, which suggests that there is an intrinsic role which tactile and bodily engagement plays in the perception of the world around us. So in terms of just finishing up in the new theory, the case of the Molyneux subject provides Berkeley with a pathological case study which reveals the hidden complexities of the process underlying our perception of spatial qualities. So certainly, to my mind, I don't think anyone else has made this claim in relation to Berkeley's new theory. So it's probably a little bit controversial. Anyway, based on his examination of the pathological case, Berkeley formulates a theory about to examine how spatial perception occurs. His conclusion is that our perceptions or ideas are the results of the subject's volitional activity. So in terms of bringing us into the relationship on God then, why am I talking to you about the new theory in this regard? So he denies that spatial judgment is a matter of kind of, as Descartes had said, we compute these things in our mind. It's not just about vision, but it's about our active engagement with the world around us. And this is really important to what comes next. So spatial perception is a process which relies on the subject's capacity to actively engage with objects located in the environment. And the central aim of the new theory is to explain how this occurs. So the thesis I've come up with to explain this, I call the constitutive volition thesis, whereby visual ideas are constituted by the subject's volitional activity. And this is significant because in the contemporary discussions of visual perception or perception in general, there's an awful lot of talk about being embodied perceivers, and that even in education more increasingly we're talking about we learn with, you know, the whole person, the whole body. And certainly within the kind of the discussions pertaining to visual perception, there's a huge amount of research, very contemporary research, that's demonstrating that it's actually through our embodied encounter with the world around us that has such a fundamental role to play in how we perceive the world spatially and objects located at a distance. So it's significant that I think that Berkeley was one of the first people to have this insight, albeit in a very modern context. But I won't pause on that too long as I want to move on. So what we're here to actually discuss, the relationship between God and man. So, okay, let's treat everything I've said for a moment as being uncontroversial. Let's just pretend that that's fine. So if perception comes about through man's volitional activity, can this then occur independently of God's involvement? So if I'm saying that it's Berkeley's position that we formulate our spatial judgments by going out and engaging in the world, and to mention as well, this is done in infancy. There's a period at which we have to learn how to do that. And so once we have achieved that insight, then we become accomplished perceivers. But he's going back to the inception, the origin and the process. But in any case, so if man can do this, where's the room for God? Or does Berkeley need God at all? Or have we written God effectively out of the equation if man can go off and formulate his own spatial judgments? So if perception comes about in the manner in which I'm suggesting that Berkeley claims, can this occur independently of God's involvement? And the fundamental answer to this is no. Berkeley proposes a truly intimate connection between divine and finite beings, which is central to his entire philosophical enterprise. There is an intimate relation between God and man, and he quotes this scripture passage 5 times, more than any other, throughout his collected works. He says, "A God in whom we live and move and have our being." And I think his theory of spatial perception is actually an attempt to show how that takes a literal manifestation in terms of the relationship between man and God. Oh yeah, okay, that's come up there. So one of the and I suppose what we'll finish with, and what I've time left to do, is just a little series of vignettes. I do apologise, I spent too much time in the new theory. But anyway, just an insight into maybe Berkeley's, the theological side of Berkeley's philosophical system. So Berkeley writes very much, I've been keen to emphasise the manner in which he preempts more contemporary thinkers, but he's quite scholastic in orientation too, and walking a beautiful line between the modern on the one hand and the very contemporary on the other. So Berkeley writes very much within this lovely Liber Mundi tradition, or book of the world. Many thinkers of the modern period offered proofs for God's existence. Berkeley begins from the premise that nature consists in a series of signs that display a divine visual language to our mind, and it is our task to study the grand text of nature, which is the true province of philosophical investigation, rather than hidden or occult entities. And here he says, so he looks at God as the author of nature within the context of this Liber Mundi tradition, or book of the world. He says, the world we perceive is a grand text or a system of signs which enable us to interpret the presence of the divinity. He says that God is the author of nature, and the characters of the divinity are large and legible throughout the whole of creation to men of plain sense and common understanding. So there is evidence all around us through our empirical encounter with our ideas, with the world around us, that God is ever present. And he compares this to a system of signs which we have the capacity to read. Also, what I think is interesting in terms of Berkeley's, one of Berkeley's entry in a later work written in 1721, De Motu, which was ostensibly his treatise with which he sought to refute Newton's mechanics. Berkeley reaffirms the distinction, as we've mentioned, one of the canonical things in Berkeley, and I'll finish quite quickly, I know we're running out of time, is the distinction between ideas and spirit. So he said there's no material things where matter is something that occurs as a substrate almost of the things we perceive, a metaphysical entity. There are ideas and spirits, or here he says corporeal things and thinking things. He says, it is certain that bodies are moved at the will of the mind, and accordingly the mind can be called a principle of motion, a particular and subordinate principle indeed, and one which itself depends on the first and universal principle. So one of the things that I suppose I wanted to propose today is that for Berkeley, one of the key parts to the relationship between man and God is that finite volition, or the spirit, the human spirit, is a subordinate principle to that of divine volition. So there's a very intimate union of God and man throughout every aspect of Berkeley's philosophy, particularly through his theory of spatial perception as presented in the new theory. So in terms of the union that Berkeley envisages, he rejects deism and this notion that God is absent from the world. It is at the very centre of Berkeley's philosophical mission to establish the providence of the deity in the natural world and our relationship therewith. Divine volition is required to create the world and also to keep it into existence. So without God, there is nothing, there is no natural world, and certainly everything hinges upon the existence of and the intercession of the divine mind in every aspect of the world for Berkeley. He's, again, one of my interpretive claims, human beings are intimately connected to God as finite volition is a subordinate principle to divine volition, as we've seen there in the De Motu entry, and God's general assistance is required to impel finite volition, as finite beings cannot operate independently of God's ongoing intervention. So just a little quote then to finish up on, as I mentioned at the start of our talk, Berkeley's main aim, or one thereof, a central objective at any rate, was to inspire my readers with a pious sense of the presence of God. And one of the lovely things I thought I'd finish on today is a lovely quote from his early notebooks, where he says, "Strange impetus of man, man without God is wretcheder than a stone or a tree, having only the powers to be made miserable by his unperformed wills, these having no power at all." So in conclusion, I put it to you that for Berkeley, there is almost a sense, a deep existential conviction in which he feels duty bound to demonstrate the presence of God in the world, and that he sees the business of philosophy to be imbued with this task, while also keeping in mind, in a very rigorous way, a very analytic approach to the scientific developments of the day. And I'll leave it there. I think I have one picture. No, that's perfect. So I'll leave it there. I'm going to stop presenting